Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Wang Yu in Beijing. China has become less mobile, with both the migrant workforce and the working age population showing a decrease in 2015. Does that mean China's population dividend has come to an end? How will the change affect the Chinese economy? And what are its implications to the country's new type of urbanization? To answer all these questions, we're joined in the studio by Michele Geraci, head of the China program at the Global Policy Institute, and Professor Qi Ye, director of the Brookings Tsinghua Center for Public Policy. But before we get started, let's have a look at this background report.
The Chinese population is going grey very quickly. Now, about 16 of every 100 Chinese residents are over the age of 60. That number could increase in the coming 3 decades to 40 out of every 100. That's about 500 million people of China's total population. As a result, a labour shortage crisis looms large. According to figures from the National Bureau of Statistics, the country experienced the deepest plunge in its working-age population in its modern history, dropping by some 5 million to about 910 million in 2015. Meanwhile, China's migrant working forces fell by 5.7 million to nearly 250 million in 2015, the first recorded decrease since the year 2000. Apart from the aging population, another main reason is that more and more migrant workers are trying to find ways of working closer to home. Factories such as Foxconn have relocated inland to take advantage of it.
My previous job kept me and my family apart. I don't really want to wait for every spring festival to see them anymore.
Wages in most parts of China remain around 10% lower than in eastern coastal regions, where 60% of the country's migrant workers are employed. But the lower living costs and proximity to homes in central and western China have apparently trumped higher wages.
The salary in Zhengzhou is increasing every year. It is now not much different from first-tier cities. The living costs are low here, and our company provides cheap meals and some work clothes, so I can save more money.
With the latest urbanization project underway in China, it is hoped that both the economy and migrant workers will benefit from having more options.
Now let's start our discussion here in the studio with Mr. Michele Geraci and Professor Qi Ye. Welcome you both to Dialogue. This background report tells us that we're seeing a shrinking working population as well as the migrant or the floating population. But how do you see the relevance of it to China's economic slowdown that we're seeing right now? Is the former the cause or the results of the latter? I'll start with you, Professor.
Well, it's actually, they are interrelated. One is the cause of the other. In the last couple of years, ever since 2011, we have seen a steady slowdown of the economy for 5 years. This is the longest decline in many, many years. And actually, you can say for the contemporary China. So ever since the new China was established, I've never seen a long period of decline. And this one has some new feature, which is in the eastern part of China, compared to the central and western part of China, you actually see the central part and the western part, they're actually growing faster in terms of GDP growth rate. So that makes it to happen for the migrant workers who, mainly from the west, they're now returning to the central part and to the western part. Now there is a new term called the eastern returnees, right? That's like the west returnees, or the urban returnees. So that just make it happen. When this happens, then you have a decline of labor force supply in the eastern part that further to bring down the economic growth rate. So they're actually interrelated.
But that also mainly explains why the migrant population is shrinking. But what do you see is the cause of the working population shrink?
The working population. So we know in the beginning of the 1960s there is a baby boomer, and then late in the end of 1970s, then we have this one child policy implemented. So you have this baby boomer. The baby boomer generation now is getting old and just began to just get out of the labor population. At the same time, we see a very shortage of supply for labor. So the two factors now coming together, we see basically we see a sudden drop in the labor population.
The first time that China reported shrinking working population was in 2012. I remember that year I went to Hangzhou and also Jiangsu province and Zhejiang province, two big labor provinces, to interview those factory owners, and they're only just seeing the beginning of the rising costs of labor. So what is the chain effect of this shrinking population? This year, 2015, we're seeing the sharpest decline. What does it mean?
It's very bad news for the future of the economic development. In my view, what we have witnessed in the past is that the migration has fueled the economic growth. Now, if we think that the income disparity is about 3 times the salary, urban versus rural, every time one person moves from the rural area to the urban cities, his salary triples. Now, with about 10, 12 million people moving from the rural areas to the city every year, as has been in the past, that has almost created, ideally, 20, 25 new million people, and out of 900 million of the work population, that's a couple of percentage point of GDP coming directly just from the fact that the farmer, instead of making 10,000 renminbi, now makes 30,000 renminbi per year. So the problem is it's a very difficult problem because we have a social goal to make this income disparity narrow, urban to rural. But if we make this narrow, then people don't move to the cities because you need this disparity to allow to fuel this migratory flow. And so the government and policymakers are stuck in the middle of this situation. Should they prioritize like fairness and income distribution, but that would mean people would not go to the city and the economy would not grow as much as before? Or should they prioritize economic growth and therefore make this 3 times ratio urban to rural even bigger? And that's a big decision because, and I think I know the solution. I know what might happen is that, let's say, some official figures may show a lowering income disparity, and indeed we see now below 3, so the official number is below 3, but the reality, the perception for the people, may be that still it could be worth to go to the city. But we have witnessed this also for the last couple of years. The farmers, we've interviewed also farmers around, we went to Guizhou, we filmed documentaries, and we noticed that very, very few people were willing to leave their home to go to the city to even for 3 times the salary, let alone for 10%.
Then, do you see the end of China's demographic or population dividend due to the shrinking workforce?
I don't really think so. We have to put this in a bigger context. Now you may say we're now approaching the end of this basic labor based population dividend. But now the overall Chinese economy is transforming from a labor intensive to a new phase. In this new phase, the skills, the talented laborers are more important. They are higher paid and they are higher demanded. So we are moving to a new phase. And I really agree with you that when we look at the discrepancy between urban and the rural supply, the rural standard for life, you still see a very big discrepancy. However, the gap is really shrinking. In the urban areas, a lot of these migrant workers, that they do not really get the kind of the life they perceived. They have hoped to get the basic public services. They don't really enjoy that. So when you put all this together, so it's really not that hard to understand why we'll see a redistribution of the population, redistribution of the labor, but at the same time we see this shift and this transformation of the Chinese economy. I think part of this is really is part of this the so-called the economic new normal. The new normal also means the spatial redistribution of the labor and the population.
You seem quite optimistic about this. In economics theory, the main drivers of economic growth are population dividends, human resources, as we always refer to, capital, as well as the advancements in the innovation of technology as well as science. During the past 30 years, China has been relying heavily on the first one, the population dividend, the human resources, the factor that we're talking about. Now, with the shrinking population, with the shrinking migrant population, what is China's way out?
Well, we have, you're right. We have four inputs: land, capital, population, and the fourth one is entrepreneurship, as we call it. Capital has already kind of been used, and China needs to be careful with the level of debt. Population is what it is. Land, you cannot expand the land, and so we need to move on this entrepreneurship area. So the innovation. The efficiency in all sides. It's not just inventing something. It's not just sending a rocket to Mars. It's just making the management practice more efficient. It's just having, from the bottom, people working in the restaurants as waiters. They should be, learning how to be faster, not spending half day playing on the mobile phones when there are no customers. That's a bad use of intellectual capital. When there are no customers from 4 to 6 in the afternoon, they should be trained to do something else, maybe how to cook, so they can move themselves up the value chain. Unfortunately, we don't see that. We see people coming, especially coming from the rural areas, coming to the city to do maybe one of these relatively low-paid jobs, but they don't move up the chain of value added. And so, we work in the university. We have, I think, the duty and the responsibility to make this happen in a way compatible with what is the grand scheme of the policymakers. But it needs to be done when children are 5, 6, 10 years old. We teach at university, we get the people that we get, and it becomes very difficult to teach innovation when they're 20 years old. But that's the way out for China, to escape the middle income trap and to give a new engine of growth, because population growth is not going to be there anymore. The paradox is that when people are poor, they move to the city for a little bit extra. The difference between starving or having just enough to eat and buying stay at home.
I'm glad that you brought up this consumption factor of this. Well, when we're seeing a shrinking working population, the immediate effect is the rising labor costs. But on the other hand, for individuals, the workers are earning more than they used to. But if you look at the bigger picture, there's a conflict here. But if you look at the bigger picture, the consumption, the demand for instance, televisions, like you mentioned, for houses and vehicles are shrinking. That would put a lot of pressure for China's intended to be consumption-driven economy, isn't it?
That's right. When you look at this, the so-called demand side, you look at the household consumption, and this is really not so reliable to count on for the further economic growth. And now we're facing the problem of export, and it looks like, well, I think that's probably why now we're so much emphasizing on the supply side instead. For the supply side, then you count on innovation, you count on the higher skilled, the talented human resources. So that's that's why I'm saying this. Maybe we are just experiencing a transition phase. In this phase, of course, you see the slowdown of the traditional sectors. But at the same time, you see the growth of the other sectors. For instance, the manufacturing sector for the last 4 years, the share of that and also the growth rate has been coming down. Meanwhile, the tertiary sector, the service sector, has been growing up very, very fast. By last year, 2015, for the first time, we actually see the service sector now is at 50%. It's more than half of the entire economy. So that is the kind of change we are observing for the economy. So I'm not really, I'm cautiously optimistic, right? Then yes, indeed, we're facing this difficulty. We're having a lot of problem, but there is an economic future. Another related issue is about this retirement, right? That's another factor why we're seeing the shrinking labor population. Well, because we have a very early age of retirement, right? By 50 years old, it gets retired. I see your video over there just now. You see a lot of people who look very, very young. They're dancing on a square. They're basically, effectively, they're not part of that labor force, but they are very healthy and they can be very productive. So this is another issue the policy need to address, and in addressing the overall supply of labor.
All right, thank you very much. Let's take a short break here, but after this, we'll tell you more implications of this shrinking migrant population as well as China's new type of urbanization. Stay with us. Welcome back to Dialogue. Here in the studio, we are joined by Mr. Michele Geraci as well as Professor Chia. Welcome again to Dialogue. You mentioned earlier, Professor Chia, about the extension of the retirement age. That may be one solution to China's working force population, but another policy that is many are interpreting as a solution to this shrinking working population is the two-child policy. First of all, do you blame the one-child policy in the past for the exhaustion of China's population force?
Well, the one-child policy has had many effects, some good, controlling the total number of people in the country. I think this has been a good example in a way for many other countries. Maybe India should learn a little bit from that. However, this comes at a cost, like every policy. The cost is that there is a bit too much pressure on single children, to study hard, the performance, the competition, because parents don't have, let's say, a second opportunity in a way, especially in the urban areas. And so the child has felt the pressure, and in most cases there's been what I call it in the country a misallocation of human capital. So children that maybe want to be, painters, they are kind of encouraged and sometimes even pushed by parents to do, economics, because they need to be a source of money, and we know that economics makes more money than being a painter.
Yeah, but in terms of demographic?
And in terms of demographic, now, even if we now have a second child, we need to wait 20 years before the newborn children become active in the workforce. So things get worse before they get better for another 20 years. So the dependency ratio will worsen until 2040. And so this is another cost. Who's going to support the older people that retire quite early, and the new ones that would be born. Now, the good solution, and maybe that's what happens in reality, is that people really will not make use of this relaxation of the policy. And we know that as income grows, people tend not to have more children. Why? Because from an economic point of view, of course, for high-income people, a child is a cost, but it's not a revenue, because when the child is 20 years old, she goes, and bye-bye. It doesn't bring back money, unlike when they live in the rural areas and they provide, manpower. And so, of course, now with the rising of the income, the tendency to have second children is now diminishing. So second child policy, I think, is a little bit too late, and it won't have any real meaningful impact on the growth of population.
Professor Chi, do you think it's too little, too late?
Well, first of all, as a parent of the two children, I really think this is a decision for the family to make. Now we are assessing the policy from the perspective of economic growth. then you may say, well, this policy served its purpose for a period of time. Now, considering the national, the macroeconomic growth, of course, we see the labor supply is a factor that is, just holding down the economic growth. But now it might be a little too late now with the new policy, with the 2 children policy now for a family. First of all, I think it might be a great idea for the single child. Right now, they have siblings. For the family, that might be a good thing. But for the economic growth, you have to wait for this new generation to grow up and enter the labor force. So I think it's probably too late to see an immediate impact on the economic growth. But in the long run, this is a great idea, right? Then the family have the freedom to choose to make that decision. So I really praise that policy, the new policy.
Well, as a mother who's expecting a second child, I, of course, praise this policy. Now, let's talk about the urbanization rate. We mentioned earlier that we're seeing 1.6% of urbanization growth rate in the year 2015. How is it consistent with the shrinking working population? How is it possible?
Well, this is a really interesting data. By the end of 2014, there was a 54.6, and by the end of last year, 2015, we now see 56.1. You're right. So we are seeing the greater growth rate for the urban population rate. This is in the last 2 decades, on average, we're seeing just roughly 1% a year. I think this higher growth rate might have to do with adjustment of the way we actually getting the data. So I'm not so sure, because this is puzzling to me also. One factor that might explain this is since 2 years ago we see some new policy, especially in the 3rd tier, 4th tier cities and towns. Now they have a lot more open policy, more lenient policy towards getting the hukou for the registry. So this might bring in a boom for the people who moving into a 3rd tier and 4th tier cities and towns. Well, that's my understanding. I may be wrong for that understanding.
Of course, one of the criteria is the hukou, the household registration system, or the urban household registration system, which can be included in the urbanization rate. Now, with this hukou system, some are saying this is the main cause of China's imbalanced distribution of resources. Now, if we ease the system, can we accelerate the urbanization growth rate?
No, I think, in the old days, we know the history of hukou. In 58, people wanted to move to the city and they were not allowed to. Then, in fact, they had to go back to the countryside in the 60s and so on. Then, slowly in the 90s, they were encouraged, they were opening up for people to move into the city. And now, actually, the local government wants and encourage actively people to move from the rural area to the city and get rid of their land. Because let's not forget that giving up the rural hukou means giving up the plot of land. Now, if I was a farmer, I would never do that, because the benefit of having a city hukou, the so-called better education for children, healthcare, school, etc., are now getting a little bit less and less, relatively speaking, less important. The main thing is, for now that we enter a period of crisis, people say, okay, I go to the city, I can work in a factory, I can maybe make sacrifices for 30,000 renminbi, but I know that things will not always as good as they are now, so I need to have a place to go back. So I will not give up my plot of land. So if I was a farmer, I would be happily coming to the city. At the end of the day, even if they have to go, even city people go to the hospital, they have to pay. There are now insurance that are developing that kind of cover almost across rural and urban hukou holders. So the value of the city hukou is now not so big as it used to be in the past, and many farmers now prefer the rural hukou. In fact, I know urban people that want to buy a rural because they want to go back to the fresh air. I don't know.
Professor, you
Yeah.
seem to be
Right.
disagreeing with this.
Basically, I agree with you, but we have to understand there is this microdynamics, you may say. When this so-called Eastern returnees, this urban returnees, the migrant workers, when they go back their hometown, they do not. Most of them end up not going back to their villages. Instead, they're going to these smaller cities and towns, the third tier and the fourth tier towns. Most of them go there, and with that, they bring in their families. All right, they bring in their children who used to stay with the grandparents in the villages. Now, because for consideration of their education, a better education in towns, in cities, I think that kind of microdynamic, might play an important role for a short period of time, a few years maybe, not more than a decade, I say. So that might explain the why we're seeing kind of a boom above normal the growth rate for the urban population rate.
Now, with fewer or less population dividend that we're seeing right now, some are counting on urbanization as China's main economic driver, because we're only seeing just a little bit above 50% of urbanization right here in China. But what is this new type of urbanization that the Chinese central government has been emphasizing all about?
But the new type of urbanization distinguishes from the past is, first of all, in the past, the emphasis was on the land. There we have an expansion of urban land, urban settlement areas. Now we're focusing on the people. Related to that, according to Premier Li Keqiang, the new urbanization will be compact as compared to the urban sprawling, have to be smart as compared to traditional ways of urbanization, and has to be low carbon and green. This is for the new type of urbanization, we have to emphasize on the quality of the growth, the quality of urban expansion, not just the regular spatial expansion of the land area. Presumably with increase of urban rate, we should have a denser population. But ironically, what happens is really the opposite. With the urbanization rate going up, their density has been declining, which is really weird. It has to do with our urban policy, with our land policy. I think the new type of urbanization is meant to address these issues.
Well, very quickly before we go, how is the new type of urbanization made possible? This is emphasizing on human-centered urbanization, but with the rural area people transforming into an urban citizen, can they afford the living costs inside cities? Are the system compatible enough?
No, I think that would be a challenge because the focus on the software, not on the hardware, has been. But it cannot just be done very quickly. So it's not just that there's a new policy and suddenly we improve the software of the country for 1.3 billion people. It takes 20, 30, 50 years. So I would be a bit more cautious with this urbanization plan. I always, half jokingly say, Chinese people have a long history, 5,000 years, and they've been farmers for 5,000 years. They can wait another 10 years. There's no need to rush them and make mistakes because urbanization, and we in Europe and in South America and even US, we have many examples of failed cities. They create problems, criminality, bad planning, and China should be careful to build a city with 100 million people because it will be the first in the world. And this is the wrong thing for China to innovate. It's a one-way path, so I would be more cautious.
Let's wait and see, and fingers crossed for China's new type of urbanization. Thank you very much for your analysis. That was Mr. Michele Geraci and Professor Tie. And that'll do it for today's dialogue. I'm Wang Yijun in Beijing. From the team here at Dialogue, thank you for listening. Goodbye for now.